Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Stuart Corr, and I'm going to discuss 152A, a new environmentally sustainable meter-dose inhaler propellant, and some of the issues associated with commercialization of this product going forward. Hopefully, after you've attended this workshop, you'll leave with a better insight into some of the issues that surround the introduction of a low GWP meter-dose inhaler propellant, and be in a position to use some of this information to take your own products forward. In this presentation, I'll cover a few different aspects of the roadmap for commercialization. Some of this involves new environmental regulation developments, for example, in the US, the AIM Act, and in the EU, the revision of the F-gas proposal that was recently published. We'll then touch on the environmental impact of 152A as a meter-dose inhaler propellant, just to underline its sustainability characteristics. We'll then move on to some of the manufacturing capabilities that have been developed for representative manufacture of 152A and the implications of that. And then we'll cover some of the safety issues associated with flammable propellants, whether that's 152A or 1234ZE. We'll cover the inhalation safety study update for 152A. As I say, some of the flammability issues associated with meter-dose inhaler propellants, and some of the industry guidance and support that's available now and under development for the use of flammable meter-dose inhaler propellants. Recently in the US, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act was passed and put into effect, and this really introduces a quota system, an allowance system for the phase down of HFC products across the market. There's a number of other emission control measures present in this legislation, including bans on disposable cylinders and so on. But in effect, it's really the quota and phase down of that quota that represents the biggest item here. As you can see from a sort of a 2019 baseline of 100% of CO2 tons, by something like 2036, we're down at around 12%. So quite a significant decrease in the availability of CO2 tons for HFC products. And clearly, meter-dose inhaler propellants of the current generation, 134A and 227, are both HFCs. However, meter-dose inhaler propellants have been given a mandatory allocation under AIM. They're exempt from phase down, and pharma companies must apply to the EPA for a quota to meet their needs. In many respects, this was quite similar to what happened in Europe with the introduction of F-gas, where meter-dose inhaler propellants were given an exemption from phase down. The requirement for allocation is still included within the total national carbon dioxide emissions total. However, the phase down aspects are not applicable to meter-dose inhaler propellants here at this point. Under AIM, there is a requirement for this allocation for meter-dose inhalers and other particular uses to be reviewed at least every 5 years by the EPA, and in doing so they will take into consideration developments in relevant technologies, for example, new meter-dose inhaler propellants. I've mentioned F-gas in Europe before. A quota and phase down has been in operation there for a number of years, and meter-dose inhalers were given an exemption from that phase down. As I say, they were still included in the total European carbon budget, but just were not subject to phase down. So their use in that respect was protected. Under original F-gas regulation, there was a requirement to review that regulation periodically, and the first of those reviews is due this year. And really, the European Commission is looking to make sure that the F-gas regulation is consistent with the Kigali timetable the Montreal Protocol, and also reflect the latest developments in technology across a number of different application areas, including metered-dose inhaler propellants. Under the proposal, and I emphasise at the moment, it is only a proposal that's been published, metered-dose inhaler propellants would no longer be exempt from phase down. In effect, they'll be included in the overall quota as before, and the total quota for the European Union will be subject to this quota phase down that we show in the graphic. So a baseline will be set at 100% up to that sort of 2024-2025 period. And then in 2027 will be the first significant reduction in quota availability, including for metered-dose inhalers. And as you can see, we're going down to around about 42% here. So something like a 58% reduction in quota availability for use in metered-dose inhalers and in other application sectors. There are then further reductions again in 2030, for example, and then periodically after that until we ultimately get to the 10% or so tail at 2048. So quite a significant change for metered-dose inhalers here. They're now potentially subject to a phase down in quota availability. In addition to that, there are a number of other measures. The Commission's had proposed that there will be a €3 per tonne of carbon dioxide fee associated with allocation of that quota, with no exemption for metered-dose inhaler propellants. So, for example, 134A with a GWP of around 1430 would have an additional €4,300 per tonne of propellant associated with quota allocation. And again, because of the higher global warming potential, it goes to about €9,700 per tonne for 227EA. This quota allocation fee will become effective for the 2024 allocation period and be repayable in advance in 2023. So a significant cost increase here associated with this CO2 tax in effect. In addition to this pan-European measure, there is also potential national taxation in member states. For example, Spain has had an HFC tax in place for a number of years. Metered-dose inhaler propellants were exempt from that tax, but that exemption looks to be lost from the end of 2024. So really, in summary, in Europe at least, it looks like challenging times ahead for the existing metered-dose inhalers in terms of availability and a significant price increase associated with this allocation fee. I must emphasise that this F-gas is a proposal at this stage and is subject to final review through the EU legislative mechanisms and will be ultimately finalised by the end of 2023. 152A update. Where are we with 152A? What are the developments? With an eye on sustainability, Cura has been active in looking at potential low-carbon metered-dose inhaler propellants for a number of years now, and we've looked at a number of different aspects here. Environmental sustainability, obviously. Inhalation safety. There's little point in having a sustainable medical propellant if the inhalation safety is compromised with respect to the existing propellants. In addition, it has to be capable of operating in successful formulations with a number of APIs across the board. It does have to have good product performance. We also have to be able to make it at scale and to GMP and in a cost-effective manner. And we also have to be able to fill metered-dose inhalers with flammable mixtures, again to GMP standards. So a number of different aspects here have to be considered in transitioning your metered-dose inhaler propellant. If we start with environmental, This graphic illustrates the carbon footprint per dose of inhalation medicine. As you can see at the bottom here, for something like a 134A type product, this would be a sort of an average product on the market, representing something like, say, a salbutamol rescue inhaler. We're looking at around sort of 250 grams of carbon dioxide per dose of medicine. Again, reflecting the higher carbon footprint of 227EA, we can see a typical dose there is up around 700 grams of CO2 per dose. If we look at 152A and a discus dry powder inhaler and a fine mist inhaler, a Spiriva fine mist inhaler, you can see that all three of these technologies, two of them are propellant free, all have carbon footprints that are broadly comparable and significantly less than those of the existing propellants. And from our position, 152A is essentially equivalent in carbon footprint to these propellant-free technologies. Each of these values we've indicated here does actually represent a spread depending on the details of the formulation and so on. But broadly speaking, 152A is essentially equivalent on a CO2 basis to the propellant-free technologies. If we look at inhalation now, Coeur has been running an inhalation safety program for a number of years. It is a comprehensive program intended to provide all of the propellant relevant data to support formulated product registration going forward, in the same way that the existing 134A and 227 propellants have their drug master file data. The 2-year carcinogenicity exposure phase was completed February last year and is undergoing the final review stages as we speak. Across all of the programme, the results to date are very promising and show broad comparability to the existing meter-dose inhaler propellants, with no safety compromise with respect to 134A. So we're very pleased and very confident that 152A will be safe for patient use going forward. We have conducted a clinical trial in the US on the propellant only. We had an IND running with the FDA, and the results and details of that were presented earlier by Philip Cool of Lovelace, and I refer you to that presentation for more details. But again, very positive results for 152A. It was tolerated well with no adverse observations. From a patient perspective, there was no significant issues of taste or smell or cold freon effect observed and recorded. So in summary, the inhalation safety program is drawing to a close. We should have a propellant DMF in the US and technical dossier in the EU to be in place sometime in 2022, sometime between summer and the end of the year. And this data will be useful in support of formulated product regulatory approval activities for our customers going forward. What about availability? In terms of manufacturing status for GMP representative grade material, we have basically finished construction and opened a UK-based facility operating adjacent to our existing 134A purification capability. This new facility is capable of several hundred tons of representative medical grade 152A and is upgradable as demand increases. As I say, it has been officially opened now, and we expect commercial operation to begin summer 2022 for, as I say, representative GMP material here. We anticipate that this early grade product will support formulation registration batches and early stage commercialization of 152A products. As I say, we have further capability and capacity planned for an expected post-2025 demand increase for 152A. Just to give you an idea of what this plant looks like, As you can see, essentially it's about a 5-story tall construction. The main height is due to the distillation purification stage of the plant. This is operation in our Rock Savage UK site, as I say, adjacent to the 134A facility. So it's there, all the steel's in place, and has been commissioned successfully. In terms of flammability, 152A, as I'm sure you're aware, is a flammable propellant. But in terms of terminology, we have to make sure we understand what we mean by flammability, and fluorocarbon flammability is subject to a number of different standards. So, for example, 152A is flammable according to the classification, labeling and packaging regulations, and to the American Society of Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers standards. 1234ZE, on the other hand, is non-flammable according to CLP, but is flammable according to ASHRAE. And from our perspective, the ASHRAE classification is the one that's most likely to be relevant to meter dose inhaler manufacturing scenarios. It's used as the basis of flammability classification by a number of international standards and building codes, for example, ISO 5149, EN 378, and others. So just to explain the ASHRAE flammability designation here, ASHRAE designates both flammability and toxicology or toxicity, and we're looking here primarily at the acute toxicity as the basis for the toxicity classification. So there are two toxicity classifications, essentially A meaning lower toxicity and B meaning higher toxicity. And we're looking at typically at 400, below 400 ppm occupational exposure limit as being the threshold for falling into the higher toxicity category. So we then also have a flammability classification. So there's no flame propagation, i.e. non-flammable, and that's category 1. We then have a lower flammability classification, category 2, which is divided into two subcategories, 2 and 2L. And then we have the higher flammability classification, category 3. So something like, say, propane would be regarded as a lower toxicity, higher flammability material. So it's A3, for example. Something like 134A, again, low toxicity, no flame propagation. So that becomes A1, just like 227EA. When we look at 152A, again, lower toxicity, so it's A, and it's in that lower flammability category, so category 2. So 152A is an A2 propellant here. And 1234ZE and a number of other low GWP alternatives fall into the 2L category. So they are less flammable than 152A, for example, but they still exhibit flame limits. An example of a B class refrigerant, for example, which also is of higher toxicity, would be ammonia, just to give you an indication here. So according to this ASHRAE ISO 817 standard, 152A is defined as A2 and 1234ZE is defined as A2L. What does this mean? In terms of sort of patient impact, there's no significant impact on patient safety, and we've confirmed this through a previous quantitative risk assessment study. A 152A aerosol basically falls into level 1 in the US NFPA aerosol categorization, so that's the lowest hazard level. Again, from the consumer safety group regulations, it basically falls into the non-flammable category, assuming you've no other co-solvents added there. It's no surprise that small aerosols represent a very small risk. We're looking at very small metered volumes and very small charge sizes here. And in addition, many existing 1,3,4-A formulations also contain significant quantities of ethanol, which could render them flammable. So from a patient impact perspective, a switch to 1,5,2-A is basically no additional risk associated with that. In terms of laboratory scale handling, these factors are generally readily addressed. Most laboratory scale activities are used to dealing with flammable solvents and so on. And again, with appropriate risk assessment, handling 1,5,2-A and other flammable propellants in the laboratory can be managed quite safely and successfully, primarily through minimised inventory and minimised volumes in use associated with adequate ventilation and basically ignition source avoidance. So what about larger scale handling? Well, here we have to move into the process safety and risk management disciplines, which many process engineers regard as a bread and butter activity. But for many lab-based people, it's something that's a bit in the new side. As I say, in terms of relevant, to help ease things in terms of bringing a lot of this guidance and so on together into one place, there is a flammable propellant safe handling guide for the pharma industry under development at the moment. And we are working with DH Industries and Recipharm to bring this together. As I say, the intention here is to provide a concise guide to some of the factors that you have to consider at each stage of the product development and manufacture process using flammable propellants. Again, to avoid reinventing the wheel and to ensure consistency with existing regulations, this guidance is based on existing standards and guidance, but with a manufacturing pharma slant applied to them. As I say, these guidances and so on are familiar to the relevant authorities, which should make approval and so on far easier. So this should be out shortly, and watch this space. So in summary, environmental considerations considered to be at the forefront of public, legislature and shareholder thinking. And PMDI, while it has a small global impact on the environment, certainly has its role to play in reducing the carbon footprint of healthcare. Flammable propellants can be managed in a GMP manufacturing environment, and whether it's a new facility or conversion will depend on the details of the particular site, particularly the facility arrangements. There is an established framework of safety and regulatory standards available that can be drawn on. Largely these come from the consumer aerosol sector. So there is a framework in place to allow designs and decisions to be made. And GMP 1,5,2-A supply chain development is progressing on a timescale that can meet the current environmental regulatory expectations. So I hope you found that useful, and thank you for listening, and we'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.